He had it all: fame, fortune, a mansion that looked like a palace. But the essential was missing: a connection with his own son. David, in a wheelchair since a tragic accident, lived isolated in his silent world, and his father, the powerful Matthew Parker, trapped in his own suffering, didn't know how to reach him. Until a caregiver named Grace Thompson did the unthinkable. She broke protocol. She defied appearances, and with a simple gesture, a dance, she made the impossible happen. What you're about to see isn't just a touching story. It's a reminder that love, empathy, and courage can break down the highest walls, even those built within ourselves. Get ready. This story will touch your heart and perhaps transform the way you see the world. Matthew Parker's perfect world. Perfect on the outside, isolated within. Matthew Parker had everything money could buy. His life was a classic example of success. A vast mansion in an exclusive neighborhood, luxurious cars parked in the garage, a billion-dollar tech company he masterfully commanded, and an enviable social circle. To an outsider, everything seemed perfect. However, behind the imposing doors and mirrored glass windows, there was a loneliness that no amount of money could cure. Matthew's greatest pain wasn't in material absences, but in the emotional distance from his own son, David. A 12-year-old boy, in a wheelchair since age 6, after an accident that had forever changed the course of their lives. David wasn't just physically limited. He had become invisible to the family, forgotten amidst obligations, protocols, and an environment where feelings were often stifled. Matthew, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, felt powerless in his son's situation. He couldn't reach that boy who needed attention, love, and above all, connection. The wheelchair David used seemed like an invisible wall separating them, an obstacle that money couldn't tear down. This silent pain consumed Matthew daily, but he rarely showed it. The strong man, always impeccably dressed, walked through the mansion's corridors with a distant gaze, trapped in an internal world full of guilt and frustration. He had everything, except the ability to reach the heart of the son he loved. The household routine was marked by strict rules, meetings, commitments, and an almost military protocol that governed the relationships between employers and staff. David lived isolated in his own room, protected, yet also forgotten, while his presence was reduced to a problem to be managed by his caregiver. Matthew couldn't share his anguish, even with his wife, who remained distant, engrossed in her own concerns. The family connection everyone longed for seemed like a distant dream, a mirage that disappeared with each passing day. It was in this scenario of apparent perfection and deep emptiness that Grace Thompson entered David's life and the entire Parker mansion. Grace, the caregiver, brought with her a sensitivity and courage that contrasted with the coldness of the surrounding environment. Coming from a humble background, she knew her role went far beyond caring for David's physical needs. It was about seeing the boy, respecting his individuality, and awakening in him the joy that seemed lost. Behind the mansion's imposing facade, Grace perceived Matthew's isolation and David's sadness. She knew that the real challenge wasn't just physical, but emotional, and with silent determination, she began to plant small seeds of change, even knowing that this might mean breaking established rules. For Matthew, Grace's arrival was a turning point. Gradually, he began to realize that perhaps what was missing wasn't more money or expensive treatments, but something simple: presence, attention, and genuine affection. He saw, for the first time in a long time, that his son could shine and be happy, even with his limitations. This inner transformation was both painful and liberating. Matthew began to confront his own fears and barriers, understanding that isolation was a prison he himself had built, and that healing would only come with the courage to feel, to expose himself, and to reconnect. What seemed like a cold and impenetrable house began to change. On the horizon, there was the possibility of a new story, a story of overcoming, inclusion, and true love. And this story would begin with a simple, yet powerful, act of courage. David, the boy in the wheelchair who faces the world and seeks to overcome. David Parker was just 12 years old, but he already faced challenges most children couldn't even imagine. Since he was 6, when a car accident took his mobility, he had been confined to a wheelchair, a physical limitation that changed his routine, how he played, and even how he dreamed. However, behind the difficulties, there was a boy with an indomitable spirit and a huge desire to overcome any obstacle. For David, the chair wasn't just an object, it was both a companion and a limit. He felt the difference between being seen as a normal child and being treated as the boy in the wheelchair, as many around him called him. This differentiation hurt, even when it wasn't said aloud. The world, to him, seemed to divide people into those who looked with pity and those who simply ignored his presence. Despite this, David never let sadness dominate his heart. He had a curious and creative mind, a special fondness for music and movements that expressed freedom, something his chair, as necessary as it was, couldn't fully restrict. In silence, he dreamed of feeling the lightness of a dance step, the sway of his body in tune with a song, the joy of moving beyond physical limitations. His relationship with his parents was complex. Matthew, his father, was distant, not from lack of love, but from fear and insecurity. His mother, emotionally absent, couldn't cope with the family's new reality. This made David feel even more isolated within his own home. The only person who truly seemed to see him was Grace Thompson, his caregiver. Grace had a special eye for the nuances of David's soul. She realized that, more than physical help, he needed someone who understood him, who encouraged him to seek his own happiness and to feel part of the world. For her, inclusion wasn't an empty word, but a daily commitment. David thus faced a silent battle against prejudice and the low self-esteem that often threatened him. At school, he felt the weight of his classmates' stares. At home, the silence that spoke louder than words. He didn't want to be a victim of circumstances. He wanted to be an example of overcoming. It was this desire to overcome that made him accept Grace's invitation to dance. An invitation that, at first glance, seemed simple, but carried the power to transform. At that moment, when the two began to move to the rhythm of the music, something changed. David was no longer confined to his chair. He was free in spirit, and this overflowed in every smile, in every bright gaze. The dance became a secret language between them, a form of expression where David could be himself, without judgment or limitations. It was also a bridge for Matthew to start seeing his son with new eyes, not as an incapacitated boy, but as a child full of life and potential. This small internal revolution that David championed with courage and the caregiver's support was the spark that ignited a greater change in the Parker family. His pursuit of overcoming wasn't just for him, but for everyone who needed to learn to love and include, to respect and value what truly mattered. David reminds us that despite difficulties, the strength born from hope and love can break any barrier, physical or emotional. His story is an invitation to look beyond appearances and recognize the value and light that each person carries within themselves. Grace Thompson, the caregiver who transforms lives with courage and love. Grace Thompson wasn't just a caregiver. She was a silent force, a transformative presence who carried with her a mission far greater than any job title or salary could define. From the first day she stepped into the Parker mansion, she realized that her task went far beyond the physical care of young David. What that boy truly needed, and perhaps the entire family, was someone who saw with their heart. The daughter of a nurse, and raised in a simple community on the outskirts of Chicago, Grace grew up learning that dignity and respect don't depend on social status, but on character. She knew that pain doesn't choose an address, and that suffering, however camouflaged behind high walls and luxurious furniture, always finds a way to be heard, even if in silence. Upon arriving at the Parker household, she found a cold routine, marked by rigid rules, social protocols, and a climate of constant emotional distance. Everything was impeccable, except the human relationships. And at the center of this sophisticated structure was David, a sweet, intelligent boy, but visibly dimmed by the absence of genuine affection. Grace quickly noticed that he didn't need pity, but encouragement. He didn't need mechanical care, but connection. And that's where her true mission began. With small actions, kind words, attentive listening, and most importantly, real presence, she began to reignite the flame of self-confidence and joy in David. But her courage went beyond discreet gestures. She dared to challenge the environment she was in. She knew that in the mansion, there was an invisible line separating employees from employers, a line that limited not only functions, but also emotions. Even so, Grace didn't hesitate when she felt she needed to cross it. It was her idea to put on some music at the end of that rainy afternoon. It was her unexpected invitation. "Shall we dance, David?" And what seemed like a simple moment of relaxation became a revolutionary act. That dance wasn't just an innocent play. It was a gesture of profound inclusion, of empowerment, of courage. It was a silent message to the world around them. David is not invisible. He feels, he dreams, he lives.
Matthew Parker, the father, watched the scene in shock. Accustomed to control and formality, he never imagined seeing his son expressing himself with such freedom. And more than that, he never thought that a household employee would have the audacity to break protocol to connect so humanly with his son. But there, standing at the living room door, what Matthew saw wasn't a breach of rules. It was a breaking of barriers. And that touched him deeply. Grace didn't ask for permission. She followed what her heart told her. And with that, unknowingly, she initiated a healing process in that family. She didn't have superpowers, but she had something even rarer: sensitivity and courage to act with love. And that was enough to transform an environment frozen by pain into a space where hope began to flourish again. Today, Grace Thompson is remembered not just as a caregiver, but as the one who dared to change a story, who touched lives with empathy, and who proved that, sometimes, all a person needs is to be truly seen. Because, in the end, that's what transforms. The gaze that welcomes, the word that encourages, the gesture that liberates. And Grace, with her simplicity and her giant heart, was exactly that. A bridge between isolation and connection, between fear and love.
Rules and protocols. How inclusion breaks barriers in the Parker Mansion. The Parker family mansion was more than a luxurious construction with marble columns and immense windows. It was a symbol of status, prestige, and, though no one would admit it, rigidity. Inside, everything followed a kind of unwritten manual, where each person had their place, their function, and most importantly, their limit. Staff were expected to remain discreet. No loud laughter, intimate questions, or attitudes outside the etiquette script. Children, like David, were treated with the same protocol: protected, cared for, but rarely heard. And when that child was in a wheelchair, the tendency was to wrap them in cotton and silence, with no one quite knowing how to handle it. In this scenario, the caregiver Grace Thompson represented an invisible threat, not for disrespecting orders or acting rebelliously, but for something far more subtle. She genuinely cared. And when someone genuinely cares, cold rules begin to lose their power in the face of empathy.
Grace saw how much David was ignored by the formalities of that house. Although everyone thought they were doing what was best for him, in practice, the boy was excluded from decisions, conversations, and even family celebrations. The father, Matthew Parker, believed that keeping everything under control was the safest way to protect his son, when, in fact, what he was doing was keeping him in a kind of emotional prison, elegant but solitary. It was then that Grace began discreetly to break down these barriers, first with small gestures, including David in common dialogues, asking for his opinion, letting him choose his own clothes for the day, the music to play. Then, with bigger actions, encouraging him to interact with the staff, helping him create playlists, organizing activities in the garden. And then, the climax, dancing with him in the mansion's main ballroom, a space reserved for business dinners, never for moments of spontaneity. That dance was a watershed moment, a simple gesture, but completely outside the protocol. The caregiver had not only taken the boy out of his chair, in a symbolic sense, but had also exposed the hypocrisy of the rules governing that house. Because at that moment, what mattered wasn't social hierarchy, job titles, or the elegant setting. It was a boy feeling alive, and a woman showing the world that inclusion isn't preached, it's practiced. Matthew, seeing the scene, didn't react immediately. It destabilized him. It was as if someone had invaded the sanctuary of his engineered perfection. But what he didn't expect was David's reaction. The smile, the sparkling eyes, the lightness in his gestures. For the first time in a long time, the boy seemed simply happy. That's when the rules began to crumble. Silently, yes, but with force. Matthew began to observe Grace differently. He started listening more, asking more, and without realizing it, he also began to break down his own internal barriers. The mansion, once cold and rehearsed, slowly began to become a home, where feelings didn't need permission to exist. That dance was just the beginning, but it showed something essential, that inclusion, when true, has the power to break down walls, including those that exist within ourselves. In the Parker home, protocols still existed, but now they were at the service of the people and not the other way around. Because when someone dares to do what is right, even if off script, everything around begins to transform. The dance that changed everything, when love conquers fear. The afternoon was quiet in the Parker mansion. Outside, the cloudy sky created an introspective atmosphere, as if time itself knew something special was about to happen. Inside the main hall, where the furniture was too expensive to be used naturally, and the heavy curtains muffled any sound of life, David sat in his wheelchair, watching Grace put on some soft music. It was a routine gesture for her, using music to create a lighter atmosphere. But that afternoon, there was something different in the air. Perhaps it was the sparkle in David's eyes, or perhaps the caregiver's persistent gaze who, with a smile, extended her hand to the boy and quietly asked, "May I have this dance?" David hesitated for a moment. His eyes sought hers, as if asking permission to believe it was possible. He had never danced, at least not like other boys. The wheelchair had always been between him and the world. But Grace wasn't expecting a perfect choreography, nor did she want to prove anything to anyone. She just wanted David to feel free. And it was there, in that hall reserved for silent events and formal gatherings, that everything began to change. Grace knelt before him, gently took his hands, and, to the rhythm of the music, began to move softly. It was an adapted, improvised dance, but full of feeling. David's arms came alive, his eyes closed for a few seconds, as if he were feeling the wind of freedom he had always imagined. He laughed. He truly laughed. A light, genuine laugh, coming from a deep place that no one had been able to reach for a long time. The sound of the music echoed softly when Matthew Parker, the father, appeared at the entrance of the hall. He was coming from a meeting he had decided to end early, bothered by a restlessness in his chest he couldn't explain. And then he saw it. Standing still, he watched the scene that seemed almost out of context for the standards of that house. His caregiver was dancing with his son in a wheelchair. But it wasn't just any dance. It was a ritual of liberation, an expression of joy and inclusion that no mansion rule had ever dared to foresee. For a few seconds, Matthew felt the impulse to interrupt. After all, this broke all protocols. But what stopped him was his son's face. It was as if he was seeing David for the first time, not as the fragile boy he needed to care for, but as a complete being, full of life, emotion, and courage. There, in silence, something inside him crumbled. Matthew felt his eyes well up, his throat tightened, his heart raced, a tear rolled down. It was the first time he had cried since the accident, not from pain, but from love, from the rediscovery of what truly mattered. Grace noticed his presence but didn't stop, and she didn't need to, because at that moment the dance had already done what it needed to do: break barriers, heal wounds, open doors. Fear, which had guided that family for so long, began to give way to affection, to real contact, to the courage to feel. When the music ended, David was breathless, but smiling like never before. Grace stood up, without fanfare, and simply looked at Matthew. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His gaze was one of gratitude, of relief, of someone who, after a long time, finally allowed himself to be a father. That dance wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't rehearsed or recorded or commented on among the staff. But it was the moment that changed everything. Because sometimes the impossible happens when we let love conquer fear. One of the moment was song with his father, is also had been common in his father. But we do, in the side of the south of life, and he said whatever the tend. Matthew's first tear, healing begins with feeling. Matthew Parker was a man accustomed to winning, a successful entrepreneur, a born leader, respected by everyone around him. The image he had built over the years was that of an unwavering man, someone who wouldn't allow himself to falter, didn't show emotions, and never let feelings interfere with business or life decisions. But behind that impeccable facade, there was a broken man. Since the accident that left his son David in a wheelchair, Matthew had become a fortress on the outside. Internally, however, he was a field of ruins. The pain silently corroded him. Guilt, even illogically, consumed him daily. He constantly asked himself, could I have prevented it? And the answer, though voiceless, always returned as a cruel whisper: you failed. The relationship with his son, once marked by play, conversations, and afternoons in the park, was replaced by distance. Matthew no longer knew how to approach him. He was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of not knowing how to comfort him, of seeing in the boy's eyes the reflection of his own powerlessness. And so, he slowly drifted away, little by little, until he became a physical presence and emotionally absent, until Grace arrived.
The caregiver didn't challenge him with harsh words. She didn't blame him, point fingers, or question his absences. She simply entered the life of that house with kindness, empathy, and true love for David.
A love that, little by little, began to bring back the sparkle in the boy's eyes. And with that, something also began to stir within Matthew, even though he resisted. But everything changed with that dance. Seeing his son, once so withdrawn, truly smiling, seeing his arms moving to the rhythm of the music, his soul expressing joy, it was like a punch to the chest that crumbled the defenses Matthew had maintained for years. And then it happened, the first tear. It wasn't a tear of sadness, it was of liberation, of relief, of reconnection. In that instant, Matthew understood what he never had the courage to admit, that his greatest pain wasn't what happened to David, but the emotional distance that had grown between them. He realized that the boy didn't need a perfect father. He needed a present father. That love doesn't demand control or strength, but rather vulnerability. And that crying wasn't a sign of weakness, but the first step towards healing. Grace, noticing his emotion, didn't say a word. She just smiled, with that serene look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, because she understood that sometimes a family's healing begins with a single gesture and a single tear. From that day on, something changed within Matthew. He began to relearn how to be by his son's side. He sat down to listen to his stories, asked about his favorite songs, started taking him to the garden, not in a hurry or out of obligation, but with calmness and affection. They began to look into each other's eyes again, to laugh together, to live. And it all began with that simple yet profound moment, a solitary tear rolling down the face of a man who, finally, had the courage to feel. Because, deep down, true transformation doesn't begin when we change others. It begins when we have the courage to look within ourselves and allow love, though wounded, though dormant, to guide our steps once more. Father and son rediscover love through presence. For a long time, the silence between Matthew and David screamed louder than any spoken word. It wasn't a comforting silence, but one of absence. Absence of connection, of exchange, of affection. Matthew believed that providing the best medical treatment, the finest equipment, the secure mansion, and the best professionals for his son would be enough to compensate for what he himself could no longer give, his presence. But love cannot be bought. Presence cannot be delegated. After the dance and the tear that flowed like a ray of light amidst the darkness, Matthew began to relearn what it means to be a father. No longer the impassive, powerful provider, but the human man, present, imperfect, willing to try. The reunion didn't come with fireworks. It came with small gestures, almost imperceptible to an outsider. One afternoon, while Grace was serving tea, Matthew sat on the rug beside David's wheelchair, something he had never done. He picked up a toy car that had been forgotten in a corner and pushed it towards his son, with a shy, almost childish smile. David looked surprised, and for the first time in a long time he smiled with sparkling eyes. Another day, Matthew took David to the garden. No cell phone, no watch, no hurry. They stayed there for almost an hour, watching the leaves sway in the wind, barely saying anything. But it was the right kind of silence, the one that welcomes, the one that unites. David, at 12 years old, understood more than he expressed. And he knew his father was trying. What was once a cold and rigid routine began to gain color. Grace started including them both in joint activities, listening to music, preparing a snack, even tending to a small garden that David had always wanted to plant but never had the encouragement for. Matthew, still with his emotional limitations, allowed himself to make mistakes, and that made all the difference. He understood that he didn't need to know all the answers. He needed to be there. David, in turn, began to open up. He told jokes, asked for help with games, invited his father to watch old movies. Every attitude, however simple, was a step in this reunion. The wheelchair was still there, but it stopped being a barrier between them. It became part of the story, not the end. Grace, silent and attentive, observed this rebirth with a warmed heart. She knew her role went far beyond physically caring for David. She was there to restore a bridge between father and son that seemed destined to crumble. And seeing them side by side, laughing at a silly joke or listening to music on the living room sofa, she felt that she was, indeed, transforming that house. Matthew also changed at work. He reduced his workload, delegated responsibilities, and discreetly began attending therapy. He no longer worried so much about what others thought. His focus was on the essential, making up for lost time and building new chapters with the son he always loved, but whom, out of fear, he had left on the sidelines.
The reunion between Matthew and David was not a return to the past, but a recreation of the present. Two wounded hearts that decided to meet in the only place where true love happens, in the now. And in this new now, made of simple conversations, sincere glances, and intertwined hands, father and son discovered that love had never left. It just needed space, time, and presence. When the mansion smiled, the transformation that inspired everyone around the Parker mansion had always been synonymous with power, wealth, and silence. A silence that wasn't calm, but rather cold. The staff walked with measured steps, conversed in whispers, and even laughter seemed out of place within those walls of impeccable marble. It was a luxurious house, yes, but without a soul. Until something began to change. And the change, like so many other silent revolutions, began with the unexpected. A dance, a smile, and a boy in a wheelchair. After that day when Grace danced with David and Matthew cried for the first time, the house was never the same. The changes weren't made with renovations or new furniture, but with gestures. Small, almost invisible, yet profoundly transformative. Grace began to move through the house with more lightness. Her laughter occasionally echoed, and no one repressed it anymore. On the contrary, the other staff members began to smile too. It was as if everyone suddenly had permission to breathe more freely. David, once isolated in his room or confined to the physical therapy room, now explored the entire house. The corridors, once silent, filled with the sound of his wheelchair's wheels and his curious questions. He talked to the gardeners, asked the cook for advice, and even started teaching the house dog to shake a paw. Matthew also changed, and his transformation was the most impactful of all. Employees, accustomed to seeing him serious, direct, and reserved, began to notice a difference. He started greeting everyone by name, asking how they were, truly smiling. Once, the butler James confided in Grace, "I never thought I'd hear Mr. Parker say thank you with such sincerity." But what was most impressive was the atmosphere. The mansion, once icy, now seemed to have life. The sun seemed to enter through the windows with more intensity. The flowers in the garden appeared more vibrant. Of course, everything remained sophisticated and luxurious, but now there was something more valuable than gold: affection.
The story of the dance spread among the staff like a beautiful whisper. Some doubted, others were moved, but everyone felt the impact. Many of them, in silence, began to reevaluate their own relationships with their families, their children, their sorrows. The transformation of Matthew and David wasn't just personal, it was contagious. Grace, with her natural sensitivity, understood that this home was being rebuilt, and not by renovations or investments, but by love. She saw the mansion smile. Yes, smile. In every corner where there was a light conversation, a shy laugh, a shared coffee, music playing. The mansion smiled when David called his father "my hero" for the first time. It smiled when Matthew started having dinner with his son at the table. It smiled when the employees began to feel proud not just of where they worked, but of whom they worked for. The change was so visible that visitors began to notice. Investors, friends, colleagues, all commented that there was something different there. A warmth, a light, a presence. And it all began with a gesture of courage, empathy, humanity. The gesture of a caregiver who dared to break protocol and touch a wounded soul with a dance. The Parker Mansion, for so long a symbol of distance, transformed into a space of connection. And perhaps that is the true definition of home. A place where love finds room to flourish, even where before there was only silence. From pain to purpose, Matthew discovers a new meaning for his life. Matthew Parker always had a clear goal: to win. From a young age, his life was a succession of achievements, academic awards, lucrative businesses, public applause. But upon reaching the top, he discovered that success by itself doesn't fill the void. And when the accident that left his son David in a wheelchair happened, everything he had built lost its luster. Pain made him retreat. Frustration silenced him. For a long time, Matthew believed that all was lost, that his only mission now was to maintain appearances and pay for the best structures for his son, while he himself slowly died inside. But when Grace danced with David and something broke, or rather opened within him, the transformation began. First came the reunion with his son, then the reconnection with his own humanity. But there was more. A seed quietly planted in his heart began to grow. What if pain could turn into purpose?
Matthew began to observe the world outside the mansion walls. For the first time, he noticed how many families lacked the minimum to care for their children with disabilities. How many children like David didn't even have a proper wheelchair. How many mothers and fathers were exhausted, alone, trying to be everything at once. These thoughts began to bother him, and this discomfort turned into action. He started discreetly. He asked his team to investigate institutions that serve children with physical disabilities. He visited rehabilitation centers without announcing who he was. He learned real, touching stories, and there he understood that his family's suffering was part of something much larger. In one of these visits, a 7-year-old boy who used a makeshift wheelchair with supermarket wheels looked at him and said, "My dream is to run like a superhero." Matthew left there with tears in his eyes and his heart aflame. From that day on, his life gained a new direction. He founded an organization called the David Project in honor of his son. The mission? To offer free access to mobility equipment, therapies, and emotional support to vulnerable families. More than donating money, Matthew became personally involved. He wanted to understand, to listen, to learn. In an interview, they asked him the reason for the change. He replied, "Pain showed me how blind I was. Today, my son taught me to see, and seeing obliges me to act." The initiative gained momentum. Business people joined, healthcare professionals offered volunteer work, and families began to receive help in various regions. What was pain turned into a seed, and the seed blossomed. David, now more participative and joyful, followed everything with enthusiasm. He gradually became the symbol of hope that the project wanted to spread. At events, it was common to see him in his chair beside his father, distributing shy and profoundly true smiles. Grace, always by his side, saw everything with the eyes of someone who believed from the beginning. She knew that when you plant love, you reap transformation. Matthew, who once isolated himself behind figures and contracts, now used his voice to give space to those who were ignored. He discovered that true power
is not in what you accumulate, but in what you share. And that purpose is born when we have the courage to face our wounds not as an end, but as a new beginning.
Far beyond the dance, the story that shocked the world.
When Grace held David's hands and danced with him for the first time, perhaps even she didn't know how much that simple gesture would cross borders. It was just a moment, an instant of affection, courage, and empathy. But in that instant, something invisible and powerful happened. A current of transformation was set in motion. And like every spark that finds fertile ground, it turned into fire, warmth, hope. The mansion, once cold and silent, became the stage for a story that would captivate the world. The millionaire, once closed off in his own pain, now inspired others with his vulnerability and rebirth. And the boy in the wheelchair, who once barely smiled, became a symbol of resilience and light. The story went viral when one of the house staff, moved, wrote an anonymous text and published it on a social media platform. He described the moment of the dance, the boss's unexpected tear, and the change in the house's atmosphere. The words, filled with truth, touched millions of hearts. Newspapers began to report. Blogs about inclusion and overcoming shared it. Television programs recounted the family's journey. And then, what was an intimate narrative became a universal story. Because everyone in some way saw themselves in it. The father who doesn't know how to show love. The child who longs to be seen. The professional who, with sensitivity, changes lives without needing to shout. Matthew, initially resistant to exposure, realized that visibility wasn't about fame, but about reach. The more people knew about it, the more hearts could be touched, the more walls could fall. Thus, he authorized the story to be told in detail, as long as it preserved its essence. Love, inclusion, empathy. The repercussion was so great that the David Project, founded by him, tripled in size within a few months. Celebrities began to support. Children from different countries sent letters to David, saying they now felt less alone. Videos of other inclusive dances began to circulate, all inspired by Grace's first gesture. And she, the caregiver with a gentle soul, became a reference. She was invited to lectures, interviews, seminars on inclusion and emotional education. But Grace always said with humility, "I just did what my heart told me. Love has no protocol." The story, now told in several languages, became a documentary, a book, and even a play in some schools.
Each version brought something new, but all maintained the same core, the power of a human gesture, of seeing the other, of breaking the silence with affection. David, now older, once spoke during an award ceremony for the project named after him. He looked at the audience, took a deep breath, and said, "I thought I couldn't dance, but someone taught me that sometimes dancing is just wanting to be together." And that changed everything. The audience erupted in cheers. Matthew cried again, this time without hiding. Grace, sitting in the front row, smiled with tearful eyes. In the end, that story wasn't just about disability, wealth, or pain. It was about humanity, about our capacity to touch others and to be profoundly touched in return, about how an attitude, however small it may seem, can ignite a light where there was only darkness. And that's how the dance of a boy in a wheelchair and a caregiver transformed a house and, unintentionally, touched the world. Grace didn't just change David's life. She lit a spark that illuminated an entire house, inspired a lost father, and touched thousands of hearts around the world. Stories like this show us that no one is too small to make a big impact. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of love again. Like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon, because here every story has the power to transform. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one dance to change everything.